Good morning, welcome to FSauce. I'm Beth Agnew, and my presentation today is Beyond Man Pages, 3 things to make your open source project a user favorite. And my function is always to have a focus on users. The overview here, I'll give you a little bio about myself, very short, and then we'll talk about how to involve users throughout the life cycle of your project. And there are 3 key areas that I think are extremely important. That includes documentation, usability, and publicity, something we often don't think about when we're talking about open source projects. I will talk a little bit about technical communication help and sum up by explaining how to deliver a superb user experience. Just a little bit about me. I'm the coordinator of the Seneca Technical Communication Program. It's a 1-year postgraduate certificate program where we take smart people and turn them into capable technical communicators. And we have our largest class ever this year, 42 students in a room built for 35. So it's been very interesting getting everybody behind a computer. I'm a veteran tech writer. I used to say I was a senior tech writer, but now as I approach my senior years, I'm a little less enamored of that term senior. And so since I've served in the military, I'll go with veteran, that's fine. I'm also a blogger and a vlogger, a video logger, and I'm a gamer. What can I say? I'm a geek. Always been a geek. Where else can you ride a Jurassic chicken wearing a silly costume except in some virtual world somewhere? That's from Rift, my current favorite. Just a reminder about the project life cycle. We don't often think of it sometimes when we're developing a project, but I think it's important to pay attention to these phases, because if you miss any of these phases, something will go wrong somewhere along the line. And the project life cycle, the development life cycle, the document life cycle, they're all very much the same. So you start with your planning. That includes your research and your analysis, sometimes a needs analysis or a feasibility study. Then you go on to designing what it is you're actually going to create, creating it on paper or virtually before you actually start building anything. Then in the building phase, we also call that development. Then we get into implementation, where we deliver, we publish, we distribute, we get it out there in front of the users. And the last phase, which is often forgotten, is the maintenance phase. How do we finalize our project? What do we do after we've delivered it, after we've shipped it? Be sure to involve the user community at every stage of your project lifecycle. That's really important, especially for open source software, where we depend on our community for feedback, for assistance, for testing, for security checks, things like that. If you can't get a community going, and I think that it's really good that you do, but I'll talk about that a little bit more in a sec, then have a representative user. Somebody who's working on your project whose focus is the user-facing aspects. How does the user interact with your project? You can have the best developers, the best coders, the best engineers, whoever you want on the project, but if you don't have somebody representing users, that end of the project, the final part of it, is going to have a few weaknesses. So here's a graphic, a little bit of the project life cycle. We started off with the initial stages, requirements and planning, specifications, leading into design, construction, code development, testing, implementation, and maintenance. Documentation fits in there. We design and plan our documentation as well. Then we go into the development stage, which is writing draft after draft after draft. Documentation is like code, iterative. You can start with the smallest amount, just what you need for the basic functionality. As Mike Hoy said this morning in his great presentation, start with what you know how to do really well. Focus on that little slice and make sure you do that perfectly. And you can do the same with your code, your documentation. Start small and then just keep iterating it. Run it through the cycle a few times, add more functionality as you get going. But as the late and famous Steve Jobs said, we miss him already, good companies ship. So you want to make sure you have something that is manageable, that you can develop to start off with, get that out, and then you can always iterate it. Reviewing and editing documentation is important, of course. You need to go through those edits. If you're not able to create documentation, edit documentation, find somebody who is good at that. There's usually somebody in your community who's interested in doing that sort of thing. And then, of course, publish and maintain at the end. We talk about usability as well. The three things that I'm talking about today: documentation, usability, and publicity. And this is how they fit into the project life cycle, the development life cycle. At the beginning stages, when you're thinking of requirements and what your project is going to be about, think of user needs. Usability is not, does the project work, but can the user do what they want to do with it? Can they achieve their goals? Can they perform the tasks that they want to do to meet those goals? And that's really important from the usability perspective, from the user perspective. Needs, then tasks, and then that leads to goal achievement. And finally, for publicity, when you're first starting your project, you may want to make an announcement. Let people know that this is what you're working on. And that's how you can start to build your community. You can find people who are interested, who are like-minded, people who might be wanting to help, who want to give of their time, their energy, their ideas, and then you get into a dialogue with those people. And a dialogue is a conversation, an exchange of ideas toward a common purpose. That's a little bit different from conversation, but in the meantime, when you're about to implement, you have an announcement going out to people, going out to the public, going out to potential users, and announcing the project that you've been working on. And then after your project is out there and being used, being downloaded, being installed, you're starting to get feedback. That's when the other conversations start to happen. You're talking to people in the community that you've been working with all along, but you're also talking to new users, new people that are coming into your community, new people that are becoming fans of the work that you've been doing. So let's take a little greater focus on documentation to start off with. Documentation and open source have a pretty good history together. As far as the Seneca TechCom program is concerned, we've had a number of students go on co-ops and work on open source projects, and those have been very successful. They've really enjoyed those. But I had one student who, a really bright young woman, was unable to get a co-op work placement. And so she decided that she would use that 4-month co-op opportunity to work on an open source project. She found the FreeMind project, and she liked that mind mapping tool. And under my direction, she worked on that documentation for 4 months and created the FreeMind user guide for version 0.8.0. FreeMind currently is at 0.9.0. Sounds like they're almost ready for some new documentation. But the FreeMind user guide, it's pretty good. She did a great job on it. And even though her background was in telecommunications, she came to us right out of university and taking our 1-year postgrad certificate, couldn't get the co-op job because in the interviews she just came across as really young and unseasoned. As she continued to work on the FreeMind user guide, she worked with developers, the developers of the software. She worked with some of the people in the community. She did the user testing. She acted as the representative user for that product. She worked very closely with everybody involved on the FreeMind team. And she honed her skills just the same way she would have had she had a co-op work placement. That paid off with a user guide that the development team thought was really good. And they continue to make that available. When you download FreeMind, if you look for documentation, this is the user guide that you get. That documentation was impressive enough that somebody out in California who was using FreeMind and liked the documentation tracked down Shailaja, through me actually, and offered her a contract to do some technical writing for him at $35 an hour. She stayed here in the Toronto area. He was in California. She worked on his project for a number of months and was able to leverage that work experience plus her experience working on the open source project into a career. When she graduated, she got hired at an engineering firm and now is in charge of their documentation there. So it's one of our happy success stories that I like to share. Documentation is important for open source projects. Developers love the code. They love the process of working on projects, and that's great. but the users really don't care what's going on under the hood. They don't care about behind the scenes. They just want to know, is this going to help me do what I want it to do? Am I going to be able to accomplish my goals with it? And that's where documentation comes in. Not only documentation that documents the code, developers should be doing that anyway, but user-facing documentation. Man pages used to be the old thing. Anybody loved man pages? We just loved man pages. Yes, we still love VI. Why, I don't know, but we do. Users like using the software when they have good documentation. Sometimes just having the manual is the safety blanket that, you know, the comfort blanket, the safety net that, that users need to know that all the T's have been crossed, all the I's dotted on this project. If you're releasing a project out into the world without any documentation, users feel that something is missing. They feel that they have nowhere to turn if they need answers. They don't want to phone somebody in the middle of the night. They don't want to go online and enter a question in the forum, perhaps be ridiculed or wait days, sometimes even months for an answer. They want to be able to look something up. So if you have some good documentation there, they can look up the problems that they're having. And it should be task-based documentation, not feature-based. In the old days, we used to document all the features. The features are great. Everybody loves the features. But knowing that there's a print function doesn't necessarily help me if I'm trying to print something that's 4 up, you know, 4 pictures on the same page. How do I do that? So users want to know how to. They want to know more than just this is the function and these are the things you can do. That's great, but we want to know how to do those things. Developers can access the code and have better collaborative development when there's some documentation. They can see beyond what's going on the interface. They can see deeply into the code when it's documented. And overall, your support liabilities are reduced. We generally think in terms of open source software that we don't have a lot of support. We don't have a 24/7 customer support department to support our open source projects in many instances, especially if you're doing them on a shoestring budget, as Mike Hoy talked about this morning. So you don't want to have those customer support liabilities where something could have been fixed, it could have been explained in the documentation, but it wasn't. So now people are confused and they have to call somebody else for help. It's great to have an open source community that is strong and vigorous. We've all seen those. We've been part of those. And when you ask for help, you get really good help. But again, what if you can't access that, or do you want to have to wait that period of time? So when you need support, it's a lot easier to look it up in the documentation. And when you have all those things, you have much more successful projects. Yeah?
I'm just wondering if in your experience you found a lot of non-technical users who are willing to read documentation.
Sure,
in
yeah.
my experience, non-technical users are really willing to force their technical friends to read documentation. They don't want to read it.
Well, there's these strange people called technical communicators that actually get a charge out of reading technical documentation. There are some people who like to read new things and who like to play with the technologies. They like to get into something that they've never dealt with before. They're fascinated by the open source movement, but they're not coders, so they don't know how to get into it. And this is a way the non-technical people can become involved in open source. And I'll say a little bit more about why that movement is so important in a bit. But if they're non-technical, starting with documentation is a really good thing. If your documentation is so technical that people can't understand it, it needs another couple of passes through the editing filter. If it's meant to be read by end users, but it's so technical that only technical users can understand it, it needs a few massages to make it a little bit more user-friendly. And that's where a technical writer can come in, and I'll speak more about those as well. Or somebody who is technical enough that they can explain things, you know, so they get it, and then they can explain it to other people. Traditionally, we had man pages, PDFs, and printed docs for our documentation in the open source world. Now it's a lot more fluid. We have more collaborative sources. We have FAQs, we have wikis, and even some documentation in EPUBs. And I'll put a plug in here for Scott Nesbitt's presentation after lunch in this room. He's going to be talking about making EPUBs, and that's something really new in the world of documentation, new being the last couple of years. It's definitely taking off. So there are a lot more ways to produce documentation than ever before, and we're even seeing multimedia documentation, multimedia PDFs, multimedia EPUBs that give people real how-to information and show them how to do things. So that's great. When you have good documentation in the open source community, it meshes everyone's interests. No matter who you have working on your project, they all have a part to play by contributing to documentation, by looking at the FAQs, the wiki, whatever you have, correcting errors. Even people who are not that technical can still correct things like grammar. You always have somebody who wants to be a grammar cop. That's fine. I love those people because they do a job that I don't then have to do. So that's fine. Good documentation allows browsing and searching. So when people need an answer, they need it now. They don't want to have to wade through chapter after chapter looking for what it is that they're trying to access. They want to be able to look it up quickly in an FAQ or a wiki, use an index or a hyperlink in an EPUB or a PDF and get that information. They want just-in-time information. Question?
So surely there's a difference between a tutorial and a reference documentation and how you access it.
Yeah, there's
kind of thing.
There's all kinds of documentation. There's tutorials, there's reference books, there's task-oriented manuals, there's FAQs. Information can be produced in any number of ways, and it depends on your audience, knowing your user. What do they need? What kind of sources are they going to be looking for? Sometimes tutorials are great, other times they're too time-consuming for people when they need a really fast answer. So you have to be thinking ahead. When we go back to that project life cycle and the planning, the research, think to the end of your project. What is going to happen when it gets into the hands of the user? What are they going to need for support? What are they going to need for documentation? Maybe a set of video tutorials on YouTube is all you need for documentation. Maybe you want printed documentation that's more text-based with graphics and flowcharts and things like that. So it depends on the needs of your project and your target user group.
I was just reacting to yours saying people want to know now, and it seems to me there's a spectrum of needs, not just one need.
Absolutely. Definitely a spectrum of needs. Some people, when they're starting to work with a new project, they don't look at the documentation, they just get right into it and start working with it. And if you have a really good user interface, where all the intelligence is built into the user interface, essentially your user interface has the documentation built in, it's got labels, it's got an intuitive way of getting from one thing to another, then those people don't ever need to pick up the documentation, probably, unless they're doing something really esoteric. Other people like to get a sense of the project that they're getting into by looking at some documentation, looking at a tutorial, things like that. So again, it's thinking, what users do you have that you're going to be serving, and what are the different needs? And I'll talk about that more in a little bit as well. And documentation these days allows publishing in multimedia, so we can have video, audio, combination thereof, text, graphics, pretty much anything, even animation. Let's talk a little bit about usability, and that ties into the whole idea of who is the user and what are they trying to do with your project. Users have a task focus. They want to get something done. They want to create a website like Fred Harper was talking about as far as Web Matrix. They want to publish something on the web. They want to create something else with whatever software that you might have created. And the end users know what they want to do, but they may not always know exactly what your project will help them do. So you need a little bit of information about your project at the beginning, that announcement that I talked about in the publicity area. What is this project and how is it going to help you? Who is your audience? There are other developers that might be using your project and be involved with it as far as the community, helping test, helping develop the code, testing different parts of it, working on different parts of it. You may have multiple audiences. You may have very technical people in your community who are working with the development of the project, but then you may have some very non-technical people who will be using it at the end. Something like Web Matrix, I'm sure the development of that is quite technical, but it's really a tool intended for non-coders, for people who don't want to have to do a lot of coding to get a website set up. You may have combination audiences where you've got both types of users that you're trying to serve with the same documentation. How do you balance between the very technical information and the non-technical reader who might have to be exposed to that? And that's where you probably need some more expert help in the form of a technical communicator who can figure that out. And then something always to remember, I teach my students this, the 5W1H. Everybody knows what that is: who, what, when, where, why, how. When you think about those things as you're creating your project, as you're creating your documentation, as you're looking at the usability aspects, the interface, the user-facing parts of your project, and then publicity, how do you get that out to people? You keep asking yourself those same questions. Who's involved in this? Who is this going to? What am I trying to achieve? Why am I trying to achieve it? What do I want them to do, think, or feel by the time that they're done, or when they get this into their hands? Where, anything place-related, when, anything time-related, and how am I going to do all of this? As I mentioned, users like that task focus over the feature-based focus. They want to accomplish things. Developers love features, but users love their tasks. So what makes sense in your context? If your end user is a community of developers, then you have very different documentation needs than if you have non-technical people who are going to use your project. Publicity. That's something people rarely think about in the open source world. There's lots of great projects out there, but how do we know about them? Unless you go to something like sourceforge.net or come to a conference like this and find out about things. I'm learning about projects that are really cool that I can use that I really didn't know about before until I came to FSOS. So getting the word out about your project is really important as well. You want to build that community. You want a bunch of users. If you only have 7 downloads in a month, you kind of wonder what all that effort was all about. You want your project used, you want it downloaded, you want it talked about. And the best way to do that these days is with social media. Increasingly, we're seeing that for many technical and even social things, the mainstream media are out of touch. The chances of getting picked up on one of the main blogs or HuffPost or something like that are very slim for open source projects, unless you have a big name behind you like Mozilla or Fedora or something like that. But you can use social media to great effect. You can start off with something as simple as just having a Twitter username and a Gmail address for your project or for your company if you've created a company around your project. You can use those. You can set up a Facebook page. You can talk about it on your own page. You need to have ways to interact with your community right from the beginning. And you can ask them questions. You can crowdsource. Talk to people who are interested in the domain in which you're creating your project. What does your project do for people? What do you hope it will do for people? Announce it. Say, we're working on this. We've just started a team to build this particular project. Talk about it. Get other people talking about it. Build your community. Have a forum. PHPBB is a really, it's free, and it's a really good little forum board that you could use. There are many others. There's lots of ways of creating a place on the internet, or a place that people, in some virtual space somewhere, Second Life, that's a whole other thing. If you want to bring people together as community where they can talk about your project and you can monitor that a little bit and get those ideas. Provide that way for your community to share information. Provide a place for them to gather. You may have users all around the world, people globally who are interested in the kind of work that you're doing. And how do you bring them together? You bring them together through the social media. It's amazing how quickly that can grow. People just retweeting something that they've heard that's a little snippet of information about your project, and it expands. It's like dropping a stone into a calm pond. The circles widen, And it's really neat to see how that community can grow. And then the interested people, the active people, may not be able to contribute code. They may not be able to contribute documentation, but they can contribute to the conversation. They can be part of that dialogue that I mentioned. They can give you ideas at the beginning or when you're in the development stage, then the design stage development, and then as you go to market with your project. And then they can give you feedback on, is it working? Is it good? What have we heard about it lately? By the way, I just saw this news item about it in this really obscure little paper. Here's that information. There's all kinds of ways that people can contribute to your project. That's what the open source community is all about. And when you have that conversation for the community to participate in, people are more kindly disposed towards your project. They're more interested in giving it a try. They're more interested in talking about it to other people. And good word of mouth is really important. At this point, I'd like to give a shameless plug. This is actually a shameless plug. I love the little face here. It was really hard finding a graphic for that, but Mike O'Dowd had created one and a Creative Commons license. Technical communicators. I'm the coordinator of the program. I have to plug it. And you may not be interested in it, but you may be interested in a graduate or a co-op student. We have co-op students. They have skills in communication, localization. Are you thinking about localization for your project? And that means, you know, if your project is going to be used in England, are you using English, or are you using Canadian, US English? And technical communicators know about that kind of stuff. Same with internationalization. If your project is going to be used in other countries, and these days we have to think about that because we have a global market that our projects go out to, how are you going to create English that is easily translatable into Spanish, French, German, Chinese, anything else? Technical communicators are really good at collaboration. They also have a technical affinity. They're really gadget junkies. They love to play with the technology. They may not be coders or developers. Some are, but some aren't. Some are people with backgrounds in fine arts and other crazy things. We had one who was an anthropologist, and she was great. She worked for Ontario Power Generation, writing about nuclear information. So they get up to speed very quickly with any kind of technology. And they have a user affinity as well. The technical communicator is really the bridge between the user and the technology. And you need somebody doing that function, whether they call themselves a technical communicator or not. You need somebody on your open source team who is thinking of the technology and thinking of the user at the same time. Occasionally that's a systems analyst, but the systems analyst tends to be a little bit more embedded in the technology. Sometimes you'll have a business analyst, and the business analyst is embedded in what the technology can do for the business problem. The third person that you can add to that team is the technical communicator who has an eye on both. Technical communicators are taught single sourcing in our program. They're taught DITA, which is the Darwin Information Typing Architecture out of IBM. They know about DocBook and XML. So they can take your content, create it once, and then output it to multiple sources. And they're pretty good at project management. They write in plain language. They simplify complex concepts. They're good at organizing and structuring information. All those things that you don't have time to do when you're working on the code, when you're working on developing the project. It's nice to be able to hand this stuff off to somebody who will just take it and run with it. And that's what technical writers do. They research users. They come to know your users better than anybody else on your team, because they're a user advocate. They sit in place of the user. And when you've got somebody who really knows your users, you've got a really good connection with that user base and your community. They research software projects. They're really good at interviewing subject matter experts. You may have somebody who's brilliant, a genius in engineering, in computer science, in nanotechnology, in genomes. It doesn't matter what it is, but the information is locked in their head because they cannot express it the way they need to for the end user. And that's where the technical writer comes in, pulls that information out of their head. We have various sneaky ways of doing that. Food always works really well. and we write it in a way that other people can understand it. So bring a technical writer into your project early. The earlier the better. And if you don't have a technical writer per se, Identify somebody in your community. Mention, when you make your product announcement at the beginning, in the early phase of your project life cycle, say that you're looking for somebody to do a technical writer or to do a documentation, user advocacy kind of role. Somebody you want involved in usability. They can wear many hats. They can be any kind of a person. They could be a developer who's interested in doing that sort of thing for you. It doesn't matter who they are, but we have lots of grads if you need a recommendation. They work closely with developers, create all kinds of documentation. I'm going to have to add EPUBs to that because we're getting into that now. They perform user testing. Often the technical communicator is the first person who really gets their hands on the product because they're documenting it. They're writing the documentation, so they're testing the product, trying to use it the way the user would to complete those tasks, and they find all the errors. So a really valuable person to have. And they assist with quality assurance, customer support, and any kind of marketing. Maybe you don't have a marketing person on your team or in your community, but you could talk to the technical communicator or the person doing that function in your community and say, we need to get the word out. So they'll pick up the social media tools and they'll start talking about your project. Paul Frields, if you were at FSOS a few years ago, Paul has been quite an inspiration to me and my students over the last few years. I was just amazed, just stunned to hear his outstanding presentation that he gave at FSOS. I think it was 2006 maybe, I forget. But I grabbed his head off the website and asked him if I could do that, and it was okay. And he is a guy, you see he's wearing a little hat with a little F on there that might be familiar to some of you if you know something about Fedora. Paul started out volunteering, unpaid, doing documentation for Linux. He just really liked Linux and he wanted to be involved in it, so he started doing documentation. That's where he could help, and that's what he did, documentation. After a few years of doing that, he got to know Linux so well, and he was well known in the community that he became a project leader at Fedora. So he turned an unpaid volunteer type gig into something that he's been enjoying and being fairly well paid at ever since. So that's a great success story for somebody on your documentation team. Unforgettable projects work really well, but they do so transparently. You use a product and you accomplish what you want to accomplish with it, and you don't realize that it's because it was so well developed. It was so well created. The interface is very intuitive. The documentation is great support. The website support is fantastic. Everything is wonderful about this project, and all you know is that it works really well, but you don't know why. Why is because somebody in that community, a bunch of people, were doing all these things that I've just talked about. It's got good documentation, good usability, and people know about it. The project provides excellent user support. Whenever you have a problem, you can get that problem solved very quickly. It has a thriving community of people willing to talk about that project, that product, help other people, and make it better all the time. It engages users and developers together. There are not two silos of tasks involved in a project. There are people that need to work together in open source. And that's one of the great things about the open source community, is that it is a community. We all work together on these projects. Good projects leverage comments and feedback. There's nothing worse than working with a product and it's not that great, and I send them feedback and I get nothing back. And then they don't incorporate it. Sorry?
There is something worse. Insulting you for boss.
Oh, yeah.
I get that.
Yeah, we don't want to know about it. Oh, that's even worse, for sure. But good projects continue to thrive, they improve, they prosper, and everybody involved is really happy that they were part of what this great project was and what it meant to people. So just a quick recap. Develop projects to suit audience needs, not developer needs, audience needs. Developer needs will be solved along the way. I need to do this code. I've been working on this thing. I've had this idea for years. I'm finally getting it out there. As Mike Hoy said, you just have to get it out there. And now I have a community of people, and you can leverage that community. Make sure you have clear, concise documentation. That's really important. I cannot stress more the importance of good information about your project. It's got good usability. You can achieve goals with it. You get the word out using social media and other tools like your website. Get documentation help if you need it. There's lots of people willing to help with documentation. People who want to be part of the open source movement, they've heard about it, they've seen it, but they don't really understand it. They look at something like FSOS and they look at all the strange names. You know, the presentation just before this one was take the red pill, enter the matrix. And unless you've seen the movie, you kind of wonder what that is. But all those things make the project unforgettable and make it something that users will really love. And I was really interested to see the t-shirt for this year. What does the t-shirt say, the t-shirt we're giving out? Anybody know? Change the code, change the world. It's fantastic. Things are changing. Please ask for change. We want change. Why did the open source movement start in the first place? It was because we were sick and tired of having software that we paid a lot of money for not work. And so people said, look, this is ridiculous. We need to come together. We need to create something. So community coming together, this is what open source is all about. Many people creating that dialogue about issues, right? We have these problems in software. We have these problems in technology that open source can solve. We came together in a collective search for solutions. We want answers to our questions. We want things that meet our needs. It's an inclusive rather than exclusive community. If you go to somebody and you say, I want to work on your open source project, they're going to say, come in, let me find something for you to do. They're not going to say, go away, you don't know anything about what I'm doing. No, it's inclusive. It adjusts as necessary on the fly. If people are going down one track with a project and they're getting feedback from the community that says, you know, we need different functionality, we need something to change here, this isn't working, then we adjust our project accordingly. And the most interesting thing about open source, Mike Hoy said it this morning, I really enjoyed that presentation, and he said, if you think open source is not profitable, you haven't been paying attention. Open source can be really profitable, and the great thing about it is that it really doesn't harm established companies. We had Microsoft here at FSOS. They see the value of open source. Unless a company gets greedy and wants to save all the money that's possible in that area for themselves, then they're not going to want open source anywhere near them. But you know what? Open source is just like the Occupy movement. If you don't know what the Occupy movement is, you need to Google that right now, because it's big and it's not going away. I've been involved a little bit with Occupy Toronto, and again, it's the same things, the community coming together, looking for answers, working together to solve problems, and making sure that it's not greed that is running things, but the needs of the users. The website there, occupyto.org, and there's a march tomorrow afternoon if you're interested. So that's it. Any questions? Yes?
It seems to me that there are narrower constraints on commercial software project design than there are in open source. What appeals to me in open source is the community aspect of people working together and not stratifying producers and consumers. Like the term user gets my back up a little bit, even though it's not always inappropriate. It's a mindset of somebody who's a consumer. And that's not what you've been using it as, because you've got champions for users in your process too. But it seems to me that it would be lovely to get towards the Wikipedia end of things, where really a lot of users feel empowered to contribute. I haven't got a good idea. There are lots of people who use Wikipedia that have never edited a page, which startles me. But do you think that maybe documentation should be the center of such a project? Like it's the contract between all the participants, in a sense, maybe more important than the code in some ways.
Yeah, I think we probably need new terminology because of the way the world is changing. The documentation, the information around something is a way that brings people together because it gives us a common language about talking about things. So whether it's Occupy, whether it's open source, whether it's, you know, the oil sands, it doesn't matter what it is. When we start that conversation, we have that dialogue, that information sharing, there are people that are involved in it and trying to get it to happen, and there are people that are observing. There are people that are critics. You know, if you look at the book The Groundswell by Charlene Lee and Josh Bernoff, it talks about social media in corporations. But they mention a couple of really important points, and that is that people take different roles depending on how they interact with a particular project or a community. So you might have somebody who's the role of the critic. They just go on forums, they just give feedback. They don't actually contribute anything other than their opinion. We have people that actually contribute, you know, code, or they do something. Down at Occupy Toronto, I saw a guy and he had a bale of straw and he was going and putting it in places where there was too much mud, and that was his contribution. And so everybody finds a way that they're comfortable with to interact with whatever it is that's going on. And I think information documentation certainly is a great place to start for that, because when you ask people questions and you get answers, that forms the basis of that initial documentation, for sure. Any other questions? Evan.
I'm always challenged by the more you do to set things up so that they're easy to use, the more you lock things in place.
Yeah.
One of the problems with open source is that because the communities are always evolving, somebody new comes along and changes something up. So we're seeing announcements of products where this year's release is completely different from last year's for very good reasons and so on. But that means all the documentation and everything just is now outdated, and not only no longer helpful, but actually harmful, because people can't figure out how things work because it says to do this and there's nothing like that. Any thoughts on how to mitigate that?
Absolutely. I think you need a really good process of change control, and you need somebody who is a de facto project manager who is leading the project. Now, that may not be the lead developer, it may not be, you know, somebody who's that technical. It's somebody who kind of rides herd on the community, or at least takes the community pulse to find out what's going on. The decisions to make changes happen, you know, at, I guess, committee level. That's a horrible corporate term, but it doesn't really work in open source. But the group of people who make that decision need to keep in mind those things, the documentation, the website, the social media, things like that. Yeah, it's really hard. But if you have somebody and you say, that's your hat and you're wearing it, and technical communicators are really perfect for that. I hate to belabor that, but that's what we do. That's what we do. We hold that function in many organizations. We see the big picture while we work on the details. And I've been in companies where I was the only one who knew what we were actually producing. Management had a view, developers had a view, marketing had a view, sales had a view, but they were all different. And because I talked to all those groups, and I kind of brought all their information together from the user's perspective, I was able to see what this thing actually did for the user. So the technical communicator, the person that does that function anyway, you need somebody who does that function, who's watching the technology, making sure that any changes get captured. Old stuff, you need to archive that, because you never know when you roll back, or you have to bring something back in because people clamor for it and they say, why did you lose that functionality? You need somebody with an eye on the technology and the other eye on the users. And again, bad term, but the people who are actually going to be using the product to do something with it, and keep those people in sync. So again, I think a lot of it is change control and mapping, product mapping, how we're doing it, where we're going from here. And sometimes projects have to branch. You know, you find out you've got 2 user groups and they want different things from the same product. Then maybe you have to have 2 different versions of the product. You might have to rename it, things like that. But all that thing needs to be tracked, and again, it's a matter of documentation, tracking that, having somebody with that documentation hat on who will keep looking at those things and adjusting and keeping an archive of the decisions that are made. You know, when you have an open source meeting, does anybody take minutes? Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. So it's a documentation function. Anything else? Wonderful. Thank you very much for being here. Enjoy FSOS, and keep on the social media. Thank you.